Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There are events in the history of any country that arrive like a detonation, that compress years of slow change into a single moment of rupture, after which the world that existed before is simply gone, replaced by something so different that the before and after might as well be two different civilizations. The California Gold Rush was one of those events. Before January 24th, 1848, California was a remote and thinly populated corner of a country that had just taken it from Mexico by force, a place of missions and ranchos and indigenous villages, and a few thousand settlers at the absolute western edge of a continent that most Americans still thought of as ending somewhere around the Missouri River. After January 24th, 1848, after a carpenter named James Marshall noticed something glinting in the tail race of a sawmill on the American River, and picked it up and turned it in his fingers, and understood, in the way that certain moments announce themselves, that everything was about to change. California became the destination of one of the largest voluntary mass migrations in human history. Within 2 years, the population of the non-indigenous people in California increased by roughly 30 times. Within a decade, the state had a railroad, a telegraph, 2 major port cities, a banking system, a newspaper industry, a legal framework, a university and planning, and a set of cultural myths about itself that it has never entirely shed. Tonight we're going to tell the whole story. Not just the gleaming surface of it, the gold, the Argonauts, the 49ers, the overnight millionaires, but everything underneath. The people who were already there when the gold was found, and what happened to them. The global migration that the discovery triggered, and the extraordinary mix of nationalities and cultures and ambitions that assembled in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The specific economics of the rush, and how they worked, and how they stopped working, and what they left behind. The politics of it, and how California's peculiar entry into the Union shaped the crisis that was already building toward the Civil War. The environmental destruction, visible to this day in the scarred hillsides and the ruined rivers of the motherlode country. The women who crossed the continent or the oceans to be in California, and what they found when they arrived. And the way that the gold rush planted in the American national imagination a set of ideas about luck and risk and reinvention and the West as a place where the rules of the established world did not apply, ideas that the country has been living with and arguing about ever since. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. And drop your city and your local time in the comments. Knowing where in the world this story is landing is always one of my favourite parts of doing this. Now dim the lights. Let the room settle. Find a comfortable position and let your shoulders drop. The fire is lit. The night is long, and we have the whole story ahead of us. Let us go west. California, in the autumn of 1847, was not quite American. But the process by which it became not quite American is itself a story worth telling, because the Mexican-American War that delivered California to the United States was one of the most controversial military conflicts in American history. A war whose justice was questioned at the time by some of the most prominent figures in American public life, and whose consequences shaped the political crisis that was already building toward the Civil War. The war had begun in April 1846, triggered by a skirmish on the disputed border between Texas, which the United States had annexed in 1845, and Mexico, in a strip of territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande that both countries claimed as their own. President Polk had dispatched General Zachary Taylor to the disputed zone with orders that seemed designed to provoke the confrontation that occurred, and when Mexican forces crossed the Rio Grande and engaged Taylor's troops, Polk sent a war message to Congress claiming that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. The claim was disputed from the beginning. Congressman Abraham Lincoln, a first-term Whig representative from Illinois, introduced his famous spot resolutions demanding that Polk identify the specific spot on American soil where the blood had been shed. And Henry David Thoreau went to jail rather than pay the taxes that funded a war he considered unjust, producing from his imprisonment the essay on civil disobedience that would eventually influence Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Ulysses Grant, who served as a young officer in the Mexican-American War and who later commanded the Union armies in the Civil War and served 2 terms as president, wrote in his memoirs that the Mexican-American War was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. His judgment was shared by many of the war's participants and has been largely confirmed by subsequent historical assessment. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February 1848, signed, as we have noted, 9 days after Marshall's discovery, creating a coincidence of timing that made the gold rush the immediate and overwhelming consequence of the territorial acquisition that the war had produced. What the United States had taken from Mexico was not empty land. It was California and New Mexico and Arizona and parts of Colorado and Wyoming and Nevada and Utah, territories that Mexico had governed with varying degrees of effectiveness and that contained a substantial population of Mexican citizens, perhaps 80,000 people in California and New Mexico together, whose property rights and civil rights the treaty promised to protect, and whose subsequent experience of American governance was a systematic demonstration that promises made to the defeated in a treaty of peace are only as good as the political will of the victor to honour them. California, in the autumn of 1847, was not quite American. It had been ceded to the United States by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War, but that treaty would not be formally signed until February 2nd, 1848, 9 days after Marshall's discovery at Sutter's Mill. In the interim, California existed in a legal grey zone, militarily occupied by American forces under Commodore Robert Stockton and General Stephen Kearny, no longer effectively under Mexican sovereignty, not yet formally incorporated into the United States, governed by a series of military officers who exercised their authority with varying degrees of legitimacy and competence. It was a place of becoming, in the specific sense that its political identity had not yet resolved into anything stable or defined. The California that was not quite American in the autumn of 1847 was itself a layered and complicated place, and understanding its layers is essential to understanding what the gold rush did to it. The deepest layer was indigenous. California had been home for thousands of years before any European arrived to the most linguistically and culturally diverse indigenous population in North America. Estimates of the pre-contact indigenous population of California range from 150,000 to 300,000 people, speaking perhaps 80 to 100 distinct languages, a density and diversity of human cultural life that had no equivalent anywhere in North America, and that was the product of the specific ecological richness of the California landscape, which offered the oak woodlands and the coastal fisheries and the interior river systems a sufficiency of food that allowed populations to be dense and sedentary in ways that the more resource-scarce environments of the Great Plains or the Great Basin did not permit. These were not nomadic peoples chasing game across vast territories. They were settled communities with established territories, elaborate ritual lives, sophisticated material cultures, and political arrangements ranging from small band-level societies to more complex chieftainships in areas of particular abundance. the California of 1847 still contained the remnants of this population, reduced already by the epidemics and the coerced labour of the Spanish mission system from whatever it had been at first contact to perhaps 150,000 people, diminished but present, still living in their territories, still speaking their languages, still practicing their cultures in forms that 2 centuries of Spanish and Mexican colonial pressure had damaged but not destroyed. The second layer was Spanish and Mexican. The mission system that the Franciscans had established beginning in 1769, stretching from San Diego to Sonoma in a chain of 21 missions, each a day's walk from the next, had been the primary instrument of Spanish colonization and of Spanish destruction of California indigenous cultures for the first 50 years of European occupation. The missions had drawn indigenous people into their compounds through a combination of inducement and compulsion, converted them to Christianity, put them to work in the mission agriculture and craft industries, and exposed them to the European diseases against which they had no immunity, killing them in numbers that the mission registers document with grim exactitude. The secularization of the missions in 1833, under the new Mexican government that had replaced the Spanish colonial administration, had in theory freed the mission indigenous people and distributed the mission lands, but in practice had simply transferred control of those lands to a new class of Mexican ranchos, large land grants to private individuals, the ranchero class, who replaced the Franciscans as the dominant landowners and employers of indigenous labour. By 1847, California's economy was a cattle economy. The ranchos ran enormous herds on the open range, produced hides and tallow for the hide trade that connected California to the global economy through the ships of the Boston merchants, and employed a workforce that included indigenous Californians, Mexican settlers, and the small number of American and European immigrants who had trickled into the territory over the preceding decade. The third layer was the recent American and European arrivals, the men and women who had come to California through various routes before the gold rush, who were there when Marshall made his discovery, and whose presence in California had already been generating political friction with the Mexican authorities that the Mexican-American War had then resolved with military force. John Sutter, the Swiss immigrant who owned the fort on the Sacramento River near which Marshall's sawmill was being built, was one of these arrivals, a man of grandiose ambition and uncertain financial ethics who had built a small empire in the Sacramento Valley through a combination of land grants from the Mexican government, indigenous labor, and the kind of frontier entrepreneurship that required the absence of any competing power to function. It was on Sutter's property that the gold was discovered. It was Sutter who, understanding immediately what the discovery would mean for his carefully constructed domain, tried to keep it secret. He failed at secrecy, as anyone with a realistic assessment of human nature would have predicted he would. Marshall told him. Sutter told his workers to keep quiet. His workers told other people. By March of 1848, enough people in the Sacramento area knew about the discovery that suppressing the information was impossible. The specific mechanism by which the news reached the broader American public was a San Francisco newspaper publisher named Samuel Brannan, who had a genius for the intersection of information and self-interest that made him ideally suited to the moment. Brannan owned a store near Sutter's fort that stood to profit enormously from an influx of miners buying supplies. He reportedly travelled to San Francisco with a vial of gold dust, walked through the streets calling out that gold had been discovered in the American River, and within days the population of San Francisco had largely departed for the Sierra Nevada foothills. Brannan became one of the first millionaires of the gold rush without ever mining an ounce of gold himself, by selling picks and shovels and food and clothing to the men who did, at prices that reflected his understanding of what a captive market would bear. The initial wave of California gold seekers were Californians, the men already in the territory who dropped whatever they were doing and headed for the hills as the news spread through the spring and summer of 1848. Mexican Californians, American settlers, sailors who jumped ship in San Francisco harbor, soldiers who deserted their posts, rancho workers who abandoned the cattle herds, they all went. The military governor of California reported to Washington that he could not maintain order because his soldiers were deserting to the gold fields at a rate that left his garrisons nearly empty. The ranchos whose cattle had been the economic foundation of Mexican California went untended. The hide trade that had been the connective tissue between California and the global economy collapsed, because the labor that had produced the hides was now digging in the Sierra Nevada. The California of 1847, the layered, complicated, not quite American California of missions and ranchos and indigenous villages, was already ending in the months before the rest of the world even knew the gold was there. The news that transformed a California story into a world event reached the eastern United States through a specific and dramatically effective channel: the annual message that President James K. Polk delivered to Congress on December the 5th, 1848. Polk was a lame duck. He had declined to seek re-election, and Zachary Taylor had won the presidency in November. But his annual message contained a paragraph about California that made everything else in it irrelevant. He confirmed that gold had been discovered in California in quantities sufficient to transform the expectations of all who hear it, and he arranged for a tea caddy containing 230 ounces of California gold to be displayed at the War Department in Washington, where it could be examined by any citizen who cared to see it. The combination of presidential confirmation and physical evidence produced an effect that the preceding months of scattered rumors and newspaper reports had not achieved. It converted the gold rush from a California story into a national and then a global phenomenon. What Polk's announcement released was not simply a desire for gold, though that was certainly present. It released something more specifically American: the accumulated energy of a country that had just won a war and doubled its territory and was vibrating with the expansionist confidence that the phrase manifest destiny had been coined to express. The 49ers who set off for California in the early months of 1849 were not primarily desperate men with nothing to lose. Many of them were young men from the northeastern and midwestern United States who had something to lose: farms, businesses, families, the beginnings of established lives, but who found the specific combination of the gold rush's promise and the cultural moment's encouragement irresistible. The gold rush offered the thing that the 19th century American imagination found most compelling: the chance to remake yourself, to leave behind whatever circumstances you'd been born into and emerge on the other side of a great journey as someone entirely different and entirely better. It was the American dream in its most literal and most geographically specific form. A dream that pointed west, that required a journey, and that promised transformation as the reward for endurance. The specific routes to California in 1849 were 3, and each of them was a significant undertaking in ways that the modern world, with its air travel and its paved roads, has difficulty fully appreciating. But before we describe those routes in their specific detail, it is worth dwelling on the experience of preparation, on what it meant in the spring of 1849 to make the decision to go to California. The decision was not made lightly, even by the men who made it impulsively. It required selling or mortgaging the farm, or leaving the business in the hands of a partner, or borrowing money from family, or simply walking away from whatever life one had been building in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Missouri. It required equipping oneself for a journey of months, buying or borrowing a wagon and oxen for the overland route, or scraping together the passage money for the sea routes, or arranging for the overland Panama crossing. It required saying goodbye to wives and parents and children with the specific uncertainty that a journey to a place most people had never heard of 2 years before imposed, not knowing if the gold was real, not knowing if the journey could be survived, not knowing if the person going and the person staying would ever occupy the same room again. The letters that 49ers wrote home from the trail and from the camps, and the letters that wives and parents wrote back, are some of the most emotionally direct documents in the American archive. A correspondence conducted across a continent by people who had no expectation of seeing each other for a year or two at minimum, and who poured into their letters the specific mixture of hope and fear and homesickness and determination that the circumstances required. The Overland Trail experience was, for the majority of those who attempted it, 5 to 6 months of sustained physical effort in conditions that began as merely uncomfortable and occasionally became genuinely life-threatening. The staging towns on the Missouri River, Independence Saint, Joseph, Westport, Council Bluffs, filled in the late winter and early spring of 1849 with wagons and oxen and horses and the men who owned them, all waiting for the prairie grass to grow high enough in late April to provide grazing for the animals that would pull the wagons the 2,000 miles to California. The timing of the departure was critical. Leave too early, and the animals would starve on the sparse early spring grass. Leave too late, and you would not reach the Sierra Nevada passes before October, when the snows closed them and the Donner Party's fate became possible again. The trail itself was a social institution, as well as a physical route, a community of several thousand wagons travelling in loose association, spacing themselves to avoid the worst of the dust and the competition for grass and water, and yet close enough together that assistance in emergency was possible, and the specific social dynamics of a moving community of strangers could develop. Wagon trains organised themselves into companies with elected captains and written constitutions before departure, establishing rules for the governance of the train that the pressures of the trail then tested and usually modified. Disputes about the pace of travel, about the allocation of water rights at scarce desert springs, about what to do with sick or disabled members of the party, about whether to take the cut-offs whose shorter distance came at the cost of uncertain water. These were the everyday politics of the Overland Trail, conducted by men who were simultaneously exhausted from the walking and the wagon driving and the animal tending and the camp-making that the trail required. The physical landscape through which the trail passed changed dramatically as the miles accumulated. The rolling green prairies of Missouri and Kansas gave way to the drier, short-grass plains of Nebraska, the landscape flattening and the sky expanding in ways that many emigrants found simultaneously beautiful and disorienting after the enclosed horizons of the eastern woodland they had grown up in. The Platte River, which the trail followed for hundreds of miles across Nebraska, was one of the great landmarks of the overland experience. Broad, shallow, full of sandbars, essentially undrinkable from its alkaline water, but providing the flat terrain and the reliable direction that the trail needed. The Black Hills and the Rocky Mountains came next, the trail finding its way through South Pass, a broad, gently sloped saddle through the Continental Divide that was the topographical key to the overland route, wide enough to be easily traversable with wagons and gentle enough to be accomplished in a day's travel. Then the Nevada Desert, which was the trial that broke many parties, the 40-mile desert between the Humboldt Sink and the Carson River, where water was scarce and the sun was brutal, and the dead animals and abandoned wagons of previous parties littered the trail as evidence of what the crossing cost. And finally, the Sierra Nevada, the wall of granite that was the last obstacle, crossed through Donner Pass or Carson Pass, depending on the route, in the specific anxiety that the lateness of the season and the uncertainty of the weather required. The oxen and horses and mules that pulled the wagons were the limiting factor of the overland journey in ways that the human emigrants sometimes failed to fully appreciate until the animals began to fail. An ox team that left Missouri in good condition in late April would reach the Nevada desert in late summer, having lost significant weight, their feet worn by the rocky terrain, their strength diminished by months of sustained exertion on a diet of whatever grass they could find. The cholera that swept through the overland emigration of 1849, killing perhaps 5,000 people along the trail that year in an outbreak that followed the specific vector of contaminated water sources, killed humans but left the animals unaffected, so that surviving parties sometimes found themselves travelling through a landscape of human graves while their animals remained healthy. The specific cruelty of this inversion, the beasts surviving when the men did not, was noted by several diarists with the dark observation that the trail had its own logic that did not coincide with a human preference for how things should work out. The specific routes to California in 1849 were three. The overland route, the California Trail, which branched off from the Oregon Trail at Fort Hall in what is now Idaho, was approximately 2,000 miles from the Missouri River, staging towns of Independence and St. Joseph and Council Bluffs, through the Great Plains, across the Rocky Mountains, across the Nevada desert, and over the Sierra Nevada, a journey that in good conditions took approximately 5 months, and that in bad conditions, as the Donner Party had demonstrated 2 years earlier, could kill you. The sea route around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America, was approximately 18,000 miles from the eastern seaboard, and took 5 to 8 months aboard the sailing ships or the newer steam-assisted vessels that increasingly made the run, a journey of extraordinary monotony punctuated by the specific terror of rounding Cape Horn in the ferocious Southern Ocean winds. The intermediate route across Panama, through 40 miles of jungle on foot and by canoe to the Pacific coast, and then north by ship, was faster than Cape Horn in theory, but exposed travellers to the malaria and cholera and yellow fever that the Panamanian jungle offered with equalizing generosity to all who passed through it. Each route attracted different populations and produced different experiences. The overland route was primarily the route of families and farming communities from the Midwest and the Upper South, people who had wagons and livestock, and the organizational culture of the agricultural frontier. The sea routes were primarily the routes of New Englanders and city dwellers from the eastern seaboard, men who were more comfortable with maritime travel and who could afford the passage fare. The Panama route attracted those in the greatest hurry, politicians and businessmen and professional men who wanted to get to California before the best opportunities were taken, and who were willing to risk the isthmus diseases for the speed advantage the shorter journey provided. Together, these three streams of migration produced the largest single-year influx of people into any territory in American history. The non-indigenous population of California went from perhaps 14,000 at the beginning of 1848 to approximately 100,000 by the end of 1849. The composition of that population was more diverse than the standard American narrative of the gold rush has traditionally acknowledged. The 49ers were not exclusively American. They were not even primarily from the United States in many of the mining districts. The gold rush was a global event from its earliest stages, attracting migrants from Chile and Peru and Mexico, from China and Hawaii, from Australia and New Zealand, from France and Germany and Britain and Ireland, from the Cape Colony in South Africa, and from the ports of the Pacific Trade Network that had been connecting the Pacific Rim for decades before gold was discovered. By 1850, California's mining camps contained men who had come from perhaps 30 different countries, speaking perhaps 15 different languages, practicing perhaps a dozen different religions, bringing with them the accumulated mining techniques of every gold-producing region in the world, and the cultural assumptions and the racial hierarchies and the social conflicts of every society they had left behind. The world that these men arrived in was not the world they had imagined during the months of preparation and the months of travel. The California of the imagination, the California that the newspaper reports and the promotional pamphlets and the letters from early arrivals had constructed in the minds of the 49ers, was a place where gold lay in the riverbeds for the taking, where any man willing to get his feet wet and his hands dirty could make a fortune in a season and return home transformed. The California that actually existed was more complicated, more physically demanding, more socially volatile, and more economically unequal than the promotional material had suggested. The transformation from imagination to reality was one of the gold rush's most consistent experiences, and the letters that miners sent home from California, preserved in archives across the country, the most immediate and most personal record of what the rush was actually like, trace that transformation with a frankness that their authors, needing to justify the decision they had made and the families they had left behind, sometimes struggled to maintain. The gold was real. That was the thing that sustained the rush through its most difficult periods, and that makes it permanently different from the fraudulent land schemes and hollow promises that punctuated American economic history before and after. The American River and the other streams draining the western slope of the Sierra Nevada did contain placer gold, free gold, gold that had been eroded from the quartz veins in the mountains by millennia of water, and deposited in the gravel of the riverbeds in quantities that genuinely could make a man rich, if he got there early enough, and worked hard enough, and had the luck to be in the right place. The accounts of the earliest miners, the men who were there in 1848, before the news had spread beyond California, when the gold was abundant and the competition was sparse, describe a reality that matched the imagination closely enough to feed it. James Marshall himself found gold in quantities in those first weeks that would have set him up for life if he'd managed it wisely, which he did not. Miners in the summer of 1848 were pulling ounces a day from the gravel bars of the American River tributaries, working with the simplest of equipment, a pan, a cradle, a sluice box, in a landscape where the gold was so accessible that stories of men finding nuggets the size of walnuts while moving rocks were not fabrications but genuine reports. By 1849, when the Great Migration arrived, the easiest gold was gone. Not all the gold, there was still a great deal of it, and men were still making genuine fortunes well into the 1850s, but the low-hanging fruit of the 1848 season had been picked by the men who were already there, and the 49ers who arrived after the long overland or sea journey found a landscape of worked-over gravel bars and established claims, and the specific social organization of mining camps that had developed in the absence of any formal law or government. The claim system, by which a miner established his right to a specific section of streambed by working it continuously and by the recognition of his neighbours, was one of those institutional improvisations that arise when a group of people with a practical problem and no formal authority are left to solve it for themselves. It worked, with the roughness and the arbitrariness that improvised systems always have, but it worked well enough to prevent the kind of total chaos that might have been expected when tens of thousands of men with no legal framework converged on the same piece of territory. The tools of placer mining were simple, and their simplicity was part of what made the early years of the rush genuinely democratic in a way that later years would not be. A miner's basic equipment: a pan, ideally a broad shallow one of iron that allowed the miner to swirl water and gravel in a circular motion and let the heavy gold settle to the bottom while the lighter material washed out over the rim, cost a few dollars and required no special knowledge to use, though using it well required practice and a feel for the material that only experience could provide. The cradle or rocker, which was the next step up in efficiency, was a wooden box with a perforated bottom mounted on curved rockers, into which gravel was shoveled and water poured while the cradle was rocked back and forth, the gold settling to the bottom through the perforations while the lighter gravel washed out. A sluice box was a long trough, through which water was run continuously, gravel shoveled in at the top, the current carrying the light material downstream and leaving the heavy gold behind in riffles on the sluice floor. Each of these tools was a marginal improvement in efficiency over the last. Each was something a man could build or buy and operate alone or with one or two partners, and each reflected the essential character of the early gold rush as a technology of individual effort applied to a common resource. The specific physics of placer mining, the fact that gold is approximately 19 times heavier than water and more than 6 times heavier than most of the rock and gravel it's found with, which means that any process that separates materials by density will tend to concentrate gold at the bottom, was one that the 49ers understood in practice, even when they could not have stated it in those terms. Gold stays where the water leaves it. Gold accumulates in the bends of rivers where the current slows, in the crevices of bedrock where lighter materials are swept away, in the gravel bars below rapids where the turbulence drops its load. Learning to read a river for gold, to look at its shape and its current and its geology, and to predict where the gold would have concentrated, was a skill that some men had and some men didn't, and it made the difference between the miners who consistently found gold and the much larger number who spent their days in cold water for wages that barely covered their food and their equipment. The daily life of the mining camps was simultaneously monotonous and anarchic, and the combination produced a social environment unlike anything most of the participants had previously experienced. The camps were organized around the practical requirements of mining: access to water, proximity to the claim, shelter from the elements, rather than around any social or aesthetic considerations, and they had the specific character of places that had been built quickly by people who expected to be somewhere else within a year or two. Tents gave way to wooden shacks as permanence began to seem less temporary. Wooden shacks became permanent buildings as enough men decided that California was home. Some of those buildings eventually became the main streets of towns that still exist. The food of the mining camps was one of the experiences that most consistently appalled men who had grown up in households where food was varied and freshly cooked. The staple of the camp diet was salt pork, beans, and hardtack or sourdough bread, prepared by whoever in the partnership had the least objection to cooking and consumed without much ceremony in the intervals between working. Fresh vegetables were a luxury whose cost in the early years of the rush was so high that scurvy, the specific vitamin C deficiency disease that the absence of fresh produce produces, was a genuine medical problem in the mining camps, treated when available by the dried apples and lime juice that some camps stocked for the purpose, and by the specific knowledge that certain wild plants could substitute for citrus in providing the necessary vitamin. The hunting that supplemented the camp diet with fresh game was an additional activity that the more skilled and the less successful miners pursued with enthusiasm, deer and bear and smaller game being present in the Sierra Nevada foothills, in quantities that the mining community's impact had not yet substantially reduced. The newspapers that sprang up in the mining camps and in San Francisco, with the speed that printing presses could be shipped from the east, were one of the gold rush's most important cultural institutions, and their character reflected the specific needs of a community that was simultaneously starved for news from the outside world and generating news at a rate that exceeded any previous California experience. The Alta California, founded in San Francisco in 1849, was the first significant newspaper of the American period, and it combined genuine reporting on California events with the reprinting of Eastern newspapers that arrived by ship weeks out of date, but that represented the most current information available about the world outside California. The mining district newspapers that followed, the Placer Times, the Miners Advocate, the Sonora Herald, were smaller and more local, but they served the same function of maintaining the connections between the isolated mining communities and the larger world from which their readers had come. The violence of the mining camps was real and frequent, and only partially controlled by the improvised legal systems that the camps developed in the absence of formal law. The disputes that generated most of the violence were disputes about mining claims, about who had established priority on a stretch of riverbed, about whether the boundaries of a claim had been respected, about whether a miner who had temporarily abandoned his claim to buy supplies had forfeited his rights to it. These disputes were adjudicated in the first instance by the community's informal mechanisms: argument, negotiation, the opinion of bystanders who were asked to judge. And when those mechanisms failed, as they sometimes did, by violence, the specific violence of the camps, the shooting and the stabbing and the occasional lynching, occurred at rates that would have alarmed any Eastern American community, but that the camps accepted with the specific pragmatism of people who had decided that the discomfort of lawlessness was preferable to the cost of the legal infrastructure that would have controlled it. The economics of the gold rush were, from relatively early in its history, the economics of a seller's market for everything except gold itself. The gold was there, but getting it required food, equipment, shelter, clothing, and the 100 other material necessities of life in the Sierra Nevada foothills, and all of these things were expensive in ways that ate into the profits of mining, at rates that the promotional literature had not adequately conveyed. The price of a barrel of flour in San Francisco went from $16 before the gold rush to $800 in the peak years. Eggs cost $1 each. A blanket cost $40. Boots that would have cost $3 on the East Coast cost $100 in the mining camps. A night's lodging in a tent was $3. A meal at a camp restaurant, a tin plate of beans and salt pork and a cup of coffee, was $1.50, at a time when an average Eastern factory worker earned perhaps $1 a day. The men who were making genuine fortunes from the gold rush were not, for the most part, the miners. They were the merchants who supplied the miners, the teamsters who transported goods to the camps, the laundresses who washed the miners' clothes, the boarding house operators who provided beds and meals, the lawyers who adjudicated the disputes that the absence of clear property law generated in endless variety. Samuel Brannan's lesson, that the safest way to profit from a gold rush is to sell supplies to the miners rather than mine for gold yourself, was not lost on the entrepreneurs who followed him. The supply chains that developed to serve the mining camps were themselves remarkable economic achievements. San Francisco, which had been a small settlement of perhaps 900 people before the gold rush, became the primary port of entry for California and the commercial hub through which almost all the goods consumed in the mining region passed, growing to a city of 25,000 by 1850 and 35,000 by 1852, with a commercial infrastructure, banks, warehouses, insurance companies, import firms, that had been constructed in a matter of months by people who understood that gold was flowing through California. and that the way to capture it was to position yourself between the gold and the things miners needed to buy. The specific commodity whose story most illuminates the gold rush's economic character was denim. Levi Strauss, a Bavarian Jewish immigrant who arrived in San Francisco in 1853 with a stock of dry goods he intended to sell to the mining camps, discovered that the demand for durable work clothing was essentially unlimited, and that the canvas and later denim trousers he began producing, reinforced with copper rivets at the stress points that tended to tear, were exactly what the mines required. The Levi Strauss company that emerged from this observation has never stopped making jeans. The cultural artifact it created, the blue jean, which has become perhaps the most globally ubiquitous garment in human history, is a direct product of the California gold rush, the physical embodiment of the intersection between the need for durable working clothes and the specific demands of placer mining. There is something simultaneously fitting and absurd about the fact that the most lasting material legacy of one of the most consequential events in American history is a pair of pants. The banking system that the gold rush produced was the institutional foundation of California's subsequent economic development, and it was built with a speed and a sophistication that reflected the specific demands of an economy in which enormous amounts of gold were being produced in one place and consumed in another. The gold that miners extracted had to be converted into something more portable and more fungible than raw dust and nuggets. It had to be weighed, assayed, coined or certificated, and transported to the commercial centres where it could be exchanged for the goods and services that the mining economy required. The assay offices and private mints that proliferated in the early years of the rush, producing gold coins stamped with the assayer's mark that circulated in California commerce before the federal government established official minting operations in San Francisco in 1854, were the nucleus of the banking system and the banking houses that grew from them. Adams and Company, Wells Fargo, the banking operations of D.O. Mills and William Ralston, became the financial infrastructure of California's first generation of economic development. Wells Fargo in particular is worth pausing on, because its origin in the gold rush illuminates something important about the relationship between frontier conditions and institutional innovation. Henry Wells and William Fargo founded their company in 1852 specifically to serve the California market, providing express delivery services and banking operations, the two being inseparable in an economy where the transportation of gold and the management of gold deposits were the same business. The Pony Express, the overland stage, the express shipment system that connected the mining camps to San Francisco and San Francisco to the eastern financial markets. All of these were expressions of the same basic problem that the gold rush had created. How do you move value efficiently across a continent that has no railroad and no telegraph yet? Wells Fargo's answer, a network of agents and express riders and eventually stagecoach routes covering the mining regions, was the solution that worked, and the company that emerged from it is still operating today, the direct institutional descendant of the men in green boxes and Concord coaches who moved gold dust across the Sierra Nevada in 1852. The mission system that the Franciscans had built across California was one of the most consequential instruments of colonial transformation in the history of the American West, and its legacy ran directly into the gold rush story. The 21 missions that stretched from San Diego de Alcalá in the south to San Francisco Solano in the north were not merely religious institutions. They were total institutions in the sociological sense, places that controlled every aspect of the lives of the people within them, from the hours of sleeping and waking to the food that was eaten to the relationships that were permitted to the language in which God was to be addressed. The indigenous people who entered the missions entered a world that bore no relationship to the world they had come from, governed by a set of rules and values and labor obligations that the Franciscan theology justified, and that the mission's physical walls and its relationship to the Spanish military enforced. When the Mexican government secularized the missions in 1833, distributing the mission lands among private grantees, and in theory freeing the mission indigenous population, the indigenous people who emerged from decades of mission life emerged into a world that had been transformed by their confinement in ways that made freedom a more complicated condition than its absence. The skills and knowledge that would have sustained them in their pre-contact way of life had been suppressed for a generation or more. The social structures, the kinship networks, the ritual specialists, the ecological knowledge held by different families and moieties had been damaged by the forced congregation and the mortality of the mission period. And the land on which those cultures had been practiced was now, legally at least, in the hands of the ranchero families who had received the mission grants. The secularization that was supposed to return the California indigenous people to freedom had delivered them instead into a new form of economic dependency, as laborers on the ranchos that had replaced the missions as the dominant institutions of California colonial society. The people who were already in California when the 49ers arrived, the California indigenous peoples whose territory the goldfields occupied, experienced the gold rush as a catastrophe of the first order, and the story of what happened to them is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American West. In 1848, approximately 150,000 indigenous Californians were alive. By 1860, after 12 years of the gold rush and American territorial expansion, the indigenous population of California had fallen to approximately 30,000. By 1900, it would fall further to perhaps 15,000. The destruction of nearly 9/10 of California's indigenous population in the second half of the 19th century was not primarily the result of disease, though disease played a role. It was primarily the result of deliberate violence, of killings and massacres, and the specific policies of extermination that the California state government enacted and funded in the 1850s. Paying bounties for indigenous scalps and financing military expeditions against indigenous communities with a consistency and a legal formality that makes the word genocide the accurate description, and not an exaggeration. The miners who poured into the Sierra Nevada foothills in 1849 and 1850 were occupying territory that was the homeland of the Maidu, the Miwok, the Nisenan, the Yokuts, and dozens of other indigenous nations. These communities had been using the rivers and the oak woodlands of the foothills for thousands of years, and the specific resources that the gold seekers were extracting, the rivers themselves, the gravel beds, the water, were the same resources that indigenous communities depended on for their food and their livelihood. The hydraulic mining that replaced placer mining in the early 1850s, pumping enormous quantities of water through hoses at high pressure to erode entire hillsides and wash the exposed gravel through sluices, destroyed the watersheds and silted the rivers to a degree that eliminated the salmon runs and the other aquatic resources that were the dietary foundation of the foothills peoples. The oak woodlands that produced the acorns that were the staple food of many California indigenous groups were cleared for mining operations and firewood and the timber demands of the rapidly growing settlements. The animals that the indigenous communities hunted were shot out by the miners who needed meat and who had no understanding of or interest in sustainable harvest. The violence was not incidental. It was organized and encouraged by the political culture of American California from its earliest years. Peter Burnett, the first elected governor of California, told the state legislature in January 1851 that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. He was not describing something he regretted. He was describing something he was committed to facilitating. The California legislature appropriated $1.5 million, an enormous sum for a state that had been organized for less than a year, to fund military expeditions against indigenous communities in the first 2 years of statehood. The expeditions that this money funded killed indigenous people in numbers that the participants sometimes recorded and sometimes did not, in massacres at Clear Lake and Bloody Island, and dozens of other sites that local memory preserved long after the state history chose to forget them. The bounty system that some California counties operated, paying for indigenous scalps and heads as proof of kills, was an incentive structure as explicit as anything in the historical record of deliberate mass killing. The indigenous people who survived did so by adapting to the conditions that survival in the new California required, by working as laborers in the mines and the ranches and the new agricultural settlements, by moving to the less accessible mountain regions where the miners were not yet going, by the specific personal and community strategies that every persecuted minority has developed across history for surviving a world that has decided it does not want them to exist. The California Indian population that survived the Gold Rush decade maintained its cultures and its languages in forms that were damaged but not eliminated, and the California tribal nations that exist today, recognized by the federal government, operating casinos and cultural programs and language preservation efforts, are the descendants of the people who survived what their ancestors experienced as an apocalypse, and what the history of the period describes accurately as a campaign of extermination that succeeded in killing the great majority of its intended victims. The Mexican Californians, the ranchero families who had been the dominant social and economic class of Mexican California, experienced the gold rush as a different kind of catastrophe, less physically violent but equally total in its ultimate effect. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that had transferred California to the United States had guaranteed the property rights of Mexican citizens who chose to remain in American California. And the California Land Act of 1851 created a commission to adjudicate the validity of Spanish and Mexican land grants. In practice, the adjudication process was a mechanism for the transfer of land from Mexican Californian ownership to American ownership. The cost of pursuing a claim through the commission, the legal fees and in the years of litigation that most claims required, was beyond the resources of most ranchero families, who had been land-rich but cash-poor before the gold rush, and who found their financial position deteriorating rapidly as the labour force that had run their operations dispersed to the gold fields, and the cattle market that had sustained their economy collapsed under the competition of American agricultural imports. By the 1860s, most of the great ranchos of Mexican California were in American hands, acquired through litigation, foreclosure, squatter pressure, and the specific vulnerability that a cash-poor family with contested title to millions of acres of land faces when surrounded by a rapidly expanding population of land-hungry settlers with lawyers. The mining camps of the Sierra Nevada foothills were among the most genuinely multicultural places in the 19th century world, and they were also among the most violently racist. And these two facts existed in the same space simultaneously, in a way that tells you something important about how multicultural environments actually work when they are not organized around principles of equality. The 49ers came from everywhere, and they brought with them the racial hierarchies and the ethnic prejudices of everywhere they came from. The result was not a democratic community of fortune seekers united by common purpose. It was a contested social space in which the question of who had the right to mine gold, and where, and under what conditions, was negotiated through a combination of formal law and informal violence in ways that consistently disadvantaged the non-American and the non-white, and occasionally the non-Anglo-Saxon. The first targets of organized exclusion were the Latin American miners, primarily from Chile and Mexico, who had arrived in California early and in large numbers, and who brought with them mining techniques developed in the silver and gold mines of their home countries that were often more sophisticated than anything the American 49ers possessed. The California Foreign Miners Tax of 1850, the first of several such laws, levied a monthly tax of $20 on foreign-born miners, a sum that represented approximately half a month's earnings for a successful miner in 1850, and that was explicitly designed to drive foreign competition out of the best mining districts. The law did not distinguish between different national origins, but was enforced primarily against Latin American and Chinese miners, and its immediate effect was to drive a significant portion of the Latin American mining community out of the diggings, either back to their home countries or into the less remunerative service economy of the camps. The Chinese miners who began arriving in California in 1849, and whose numbers grew rapidly through the early 1850s, there were approximately 25,000 Chinese in California by 1852, making them the largest non-Anglo-Saxon ethnic group in the state, occupied a peculiar position in the gold rush social order that combined economic indispensability with social contempt in proportions that varied by location and by period, but that consistently resolved against the Chinese. They came primarily from the Pearl River Delta region of Guangdong province in southern China, driven by the combination of economic disruption from the Taiping Rebellion and the specific information networks that connected the Pearl River Delta to the California goldfields through the maritime trade routes of the Pacific. They called California Gamsan, Gold Mountain, and the men who went there typically expected to make their fortunes and return home, the sojourner model of migration that shaped the Chinese-American relationship for generations. What they found in California was a society that wanted their labor and despised their presence. Chinese miners were excluded from the best claims by the informal organization of the mining camps, pushed to the worked-over claims that American miners had abandoned, taxed at disproportionate rates, subjected to violence that the legal system rarely prosecuted, and denied the right to testify in court against white defendants under a California Supreme Court ruling of 1854 that extended to Chinese miners a rule originally established to exclude indigenous testimony. Despite these conditions, Chinese miners were remarkably productive. Their patience and their willingness to work the marginal claims that others had left behind, combined with mining techniques developed over centuries of Chinese placer gold mining that extracted gold from gravels that American methods had missed, made them a significant economic force in the California mining economy throughout the 1850s. The Chinese also constituted a significant portion of the labor force that built the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s, carrying the work of connecting California to the rest of the continent on their backs in a way that the celebration of the railroad's completion at Promontory Summit in 1869 did not acknowledge, and that American history did not fully reckon with for another century. The other foreign miners who populated the gold rush camps, the Chileans and Peruvians and Mexicans, the French who came in such numbers that their community was called the French Camp in many mining districts, the Australians, some of whom had gold mining experience from rushes in New South Wales, the Germans and Irish and Cornish who brought the hard rock mining techniques of the European metallic mining tradition, each had their own experience of the gold rush's racial and ethnic hierarchy, their own place in the pecking order that the camps established through custom and violence and occasional formal law. The Cornish miners from the tin and copper mines of Cornwall were welcomed for their expertise in hard rock mining technique and assimilated relatively quickly into the Anglo-Saxon mainstream. The French were tolerated and sometimes admired. The Chileans and Mexicans were taxed and sometimes expelled. The Chinese were permanently othered in ways that the law would eventually formalize in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first American law to exclude an ethnic group from immigration by name. The women who went to California during the gold rush have received less historical attention than the men, which is both demographically understandable. Women were a small minority of the 49er population, perhaps 5% in the early years, and historically unfortunate because the women who went to California were among the most remarkable individuals of a generation of remarkable individuals, and their experience of the rush illuminated dimensions of the event that the male-focused narrative consistently misses. They came by the same 3 routes as the men, enduring the same privations of the overland trail or the sea voyage, and they arrived in a society that was simultaneously desperate for their presence. A camp of miners is also a camp of men who have not eaten a woman's cooking, or slept in a clean bed, or experienced ordinary domestic comfort in months, and who will pay extraordinary prices for ordinary domestic services, and deeply ambivalent about what their presence meant. The economic opportunities that the gold rush created for women were, in their way, as dramatic as the opportunities it created for male miners, and arguably more reliable. The laundress who charged $8 for a basket of washing, when the same service would have cost 50 cents in Massachusetts, was making a living that exceeded what most men were making in the diggings. The boarding house keeper who charged $1 a meal and provided 30 or 40 miners with 3 meals a day was operating a business with profit margins that the most successful mining operations could not consistently match. The seamstress who charged $1 a button and more for more substantial work was selling a service so scarce in the all-male camps that she could name her price and expect it to be paid. These were not glamorous enterprises, but they were profitable ones, and the women who ran them were doing something that the promotional literature of the gold rush had not bothered to mention, because it was work that women did, rather than the heroic adventure that men dreamed of. The letters and diaries that women left from the gold rush years are some of the most vivid documents of the experience. Louise Clapp, who accompanied her physician husband to the mining camps and wrote under the pen name Dame Shirley, a series of letters to her sister back east that were eventually published in the Pioneer magazine of San Francisco, produced what may be the finest literary account of the gold rush from any perspective. Funny, sharp, physically specific, unromantic about the violence and the hardship without being unable to see the genuine wildness and colour of the world she was describing. Her description of the mining camps, the mud and the noise and the constant sound of Spanish and French and Chinese and various American dialects all being spoken simultaneously, the extraordinary food prices and the extraordinary willingness to pay them, the specific social dynamics of a community of men who had left everything familiar behind and were improvising a social order from scratch, is irreplaceable as a historical document and genuinely pleasurable as a piece of writing. The prostitutes who worked in the mining camps occupied a position in the gold rush economy that was both economically central and socially marginalized in ways that the period's moral categories made it difficult to discuss honestly either then or for a long time after. They were there from the earliest days of the rush, drawn by the same economic opportunity that drew everyone else, operating in establishments that range from the cribs that line the back streets of the mining towns to the more elaborate parlour houses of San Francisco that catered to the wealthier end of the market. Many were not in California by free choice. The specific mechanisms by which women ended up in mining camp prostitution range from economic desperation through various forms of coercion to the outright trafficking that was documented in the Chinese community, where women were sometimes brought from China under debt bondage arrangements that bore no relationship to the voluntary labour migration the men represented. The moral panic about Chinese prostitution that was one of the contributing factors to the Chinese Exclusion Act was not entirely fabricated. Trafficking of Chinese women to California was real and documented, but it was applied with a hypocrisy that ignored the coercive conditions of much non-Chinese sex work, and that used the genuine problem of trafficking as a cover for a broader project of Chinese exclusion. Before we examine the physical transformation, it is worth pausing on something that is easy to overlook when telling the gold rush story from the California end: its global economic consequences. The gold that came out of California in the years between 1848 and 1855, approximately 750,000 pounds of gold, worth something in the range of $560 million at the prices of the period, was the largest single injection of new monetary gold into the world economy since the Spanish conquest of Peru in the 16th century, and its effects on global prices, on international trade patterns, and on the monetary systems of the major economic powers were felt across the entire Atlantic world and beyond. The gold standard that Britain had adopted in 1821, the commitment to maintain a fixed price of gold in pounds sterling and to redeem pounds for gold on demand, meant that an increase in the world gold supply was effectively an increase in the world money supply, and the California gold did exactly what economic theory predicts. An increase in the money supply will do. It stimulated economic activity and raised prices across the global economy. The Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace in London, the First World's Fair, a celebration of industrial achievement and global commerce that drew 6 million visitors, was organised and attended in an atmosphere of economic optimism that the California gold was significantly fueling, the sense that the world economy was expanding faster than anyone had predicted, and that the old constraints of credit scarcity were loosening. In Australia, the news of the California gold rush triggered a domestic gold rush of its own. Australian prospectors who had gone to California learned placer mining techniques and returned home, combined with the news of California's success and the geographic knowledge that Australia's geology was in some respects similar to California's, led to a series of gold discoveries in New South Wales and Victoria in 1851 that produced a rush almost as spectacular as California's. The Australian gold rush of the 1850s transformed that continent's economy and society in ways that closely paralleled California's experience. Mass migration, rapid urbanization, the emergence of democratic political institutions in Victoria that were directly modelled on the self-governing experiments of the California mining camps, and the specific cultural mythology of the digger that became as central to Australian national identity as the 49er became to American. In China, the connection was more direct and more fraught. The emigration to California, Gamsan Gold Mountain, was part of a broader pattern of Chinese labour migration to the Pacific world that the Taiping Rebellion and its economic disruptions were driving in the 1850s, and the remittances that Chinese California sent home, the gold earnings that the Chinese miners sent back to their families in the Pearl River Delta, were a significant source of capital for communities that the rebellion was devastating. The specific villages of the Pearl River Delta that sent men to California in the 1850s still have descendants in California today, the migration chain that began with the gold rush having proved more permanent than most of its participants intended. The physical transformation that the gold rush worked on the California landscape. The physical transformation that the gold rush worked on the California landscape is one of its most enduring and most visible legacies, and it was a transformation of a violence and a thoroughness that the 19th century did not have the conceptual framework to fully recognize as a problem, because the conceptual framework for thinking about environmental destruction as a category of harm was not yet available. The miners who came to California in 1849 did not think of themselves as environmental destroyers. They thought of themselves as men doing what men did with nature, using it for human purposes, extracting its resources, making it productive in the specific sense of productive that the 19th century used, which meant productive of cash income and economic growth. The early placer mining of 1848 and 1849 was environmentally relatively benign. A pan and a cradle in a streambed disturbs a streambed, but the disturbance is limited, and the river's own flow gradually restores something of what was moved. The sluice box operations that followed were more disruptive, moving larger volumes of material and rerouting water through man-made channels in ways that altered stream flows and deposited tailings that buried the original streambed under layers of processed gravel. But these were minor compared to what came next. Hydraulic mining. Hydraulic mining was invented in California in 1853 by Edward Mattison, and it was one of those technological innovations that is genuinely extraordinary in its efficiency and genuinely catastrophic in its side effects. The principle was simple. Aim a nozzle, a monitor in the technical terminology, capable of projecting a stream of water at enormous pressure at a hillside containing gold-bearing gravel, and let the water do the work of erosion. An entire hillside, the accumulated work of geological time, could be dissolved in days. The resulting slurry of water and gravel and clay run through a sluice to catch the gold, and then discharged into the nearest convenient watercourse as tailings. The monitors required enormous quantities of water, which mining companies provided through elaborate systems of canals and flumes and reservoirs that redirected water from the Sierra Nevada snowpack at costs that required the capital investment of mining corporations rather than individual miners, marking the transition from the gold rush's democratic phase to its industrial phase. The environmental consequences of hydraulic mining were catastrophic, at a scale that would be difficult to overstate. The Sierra Nevada foothills were visibly scarred, vast areas of hillside reduced to bare clay, the original soil and vegetation gone, the exposed mineral subsoil baking in the California sun in a sterility that would take decades to begin recovering. The rivers that carried the tailings, the American River, the Yuba River, the Bear River, filled with sediment to depths that altered their channels, raised their banks and extended their deltas into San Francisco Bay at rates that navigation surveys documented with increasing alarm. Sacramento, which sat on the floodplain of the American River, experienced floods of increasing severity and duration as the river's bottom rose with accumulated hydraulic tailings, requiring the city to eventually raise its entire street level by several feet. Walking through the underground passages of old Sacramento today, you're walking through what were once the ground floors of 1850s buildings, now below the raised street level that the hydraulic mining debris required. The salmon runs of the Sierra Nevada rivers, which had sustained indigenous communities for thousands of years and which had begun to feed the rapidly growing California population, collapsed under the sedimentation, the altered temperatures, and the physical destruction of the spawning gravels that hydraulic mining produced. The legal response to hydraulic mining's environmental destruction was one of the first significant environmental regulations in American history, and it was produced not by concern for the environment in the modern sense, but by the economic interests of the Sacramento Valley farmers, who were watching their fields buried under the silt that the hydraulic operations were flushing downstream. The farmers organized, litigated, and eventually in 1884 won the Sawyer decision, a federal injunction against the discharge of hydraulic mining debris into the waterways of the Sacramento Valley, which effectively ended large-scale hydraulic mining in California. The decision was environmental law in outcome, if not in intention, the product of a conflict between two sets of economic interests in which the farmers were downstream and the miners were upstream, and it remains one of the few cases in the history of the American West where the environmental damage of extractive industry was checked before it ran its course. San Francisco's transformation during the gold rush years was one of the most spectacular episodes of urban growth in the history of the world. The small settlement at the tip of the San Francisco Peninsula, 900 people in early 1848, was transformed by the logic of its geography into the commercial capital of the gold rush as inexorably as water runs downhill. The Bay of San Francisco was the finest natural harbour on the Pacific coast of North America, the gateway through which almost everything that came to California by sea had to pass, and the city that grew around that harbour grew in ways that reflected the specific character of the gold rush economy. Fast, improvisational, spectacularly expensive, prone to disaster, and equally prone to rapid recovery. The city burned 6 times in 18 months between December 1849 and June 1851, the fires spreading with devastating efficiency through the canvas tents and wooden buildings that were the primary construction materials of a city growing faster than permanent structures could be erected. After each fire, the city rebuilt, typically in a matter of weeks, with the specific energy of a community where everyone understood that the commercial opportunity that the location represented was not going to wait for grief or careful planning. The rebuilding after each fire was in slightly more permanent materials than what had burned. Canvas tents replaced by wooden frame buildings replaced by brick construction, so that the San Francisco of 1855 was a substantially more solid city than the San Francisco of 1849, the fires having served an inadvertent function as an accelerant of permanence. The social culture of Gold Rush San Francisco was, in the early years, almost entirely male and almost entirely oriented toward the specific pleasures that men with money and no domestic responsibilities are inclined to pursue. The gambling houses that lined Portsmouth Square operated around the clock, offering faro and monte and poker and various other games at tables where the stakes were denominated in gold dust that miners poured from leather pouches onto the felt with a casualness that reflected their understanding that there was more where that came from, an understanding that was sometimes accurate and sometimes not. The bars, called saloons or banking houses or by various other euphemisms, served the extraordinary quantities of alcohol that the Gold Rush California consumed in quantities per capita that would alarm any modern public health official. The theatrical performances and concerts and circus acts that competed for the disposable income of the mining community ranged from the genuinely accomplished to the simply eccentric, in a culture that was willing to pay high prices for almost any form of entertainment simply because entertainment was scarce and gold dust was relatively plentiful. The Barbary Coast district that developed in San Francisco's waterfront neighborhood in the early 1850s became, within a decade, one of the most notorious red light districts in the world, a concentrated zone of saloons, dance halls, gambling parlours and brothels that catered to the maritime workers and itinerant miners who passed through the city, and whose reputation for violence and vice drew investigative journalists and reform crusaders and curious tourists for decades. The specific dangers of the Barbary Coast, the crimps who drugged unwary sailors and sold them to ships that needed crew, the gambling operators whose practices range from merely dishonest to elaborate confidence schemes, the general assumption that a man who wandered into the wrong alley with a visible money belt was providing an opportunity rather than encountering a criminal problem, were real enough that the Barbary Coast's reputation was not entirely exaggerated. though the exaggeration was substantial and served various moral and commercial purposes. The Vigilance Committees of 1851 and 1856 were the gold rush's most dramatic expression of the tension between the need for order and the inadequacy of formal legal institutions to provide it. The 1851 committee was organised in response to a wave of crime attributed primarily, in the narrative that the committee's supporters promoted, to Australian ex-convicts known as Sydney Ducks, who had arrived with the gold rush migrants and who were alleged to be responsible for many of the fires and robberies that plagued the city. The committee hanged 4 men, flogged 1, and deported 28 before disbanding, having provided a demonstration that the commercial class of San Francisco was willing to take extra-legal action when the formal legal system appeared inadequate. The 1856 committee, organised in response to the murder of a Reform newspaper editor by a political operative connected to the Democratic Party machine that dominated San Francisco politics, was larger and more organised, hanging 2 men and forcing the resignation of the political machine that had been running the city. Both episodes were extra-legal exercises of power by the commercial establishment that were simultaneously genuine responses to real problems of order and convenient tools for the elimination of political opponents and racial minorities, the 2 functions being mixed in proportions that the participants were not always honest about, and that historians have been arguing about ever since. The political story of California's entry into the United States is inseparable from the story of slavery, and the gold rush's acceleration of California's development forced a political crisis whose implications reached far beyond California itself. The Mexican-American War had acquired an enormous tract of territory from Mexico, and the question of whether slavery would be permitted in that territory, which had been asked from the moment the war began, and which James K. Polk's announcement of the gold discovery made suddenly and urgently practical, was the question that the Compromise of 1850 attempted to resolve, and that proved, ultimately, irresolvable short of civil war. California's application for statehood as a free state in 1850 was the proximate trigger of the crisis. The California Constitutional Convention of September 1849, a gathering of 48 delegates, most of them recent arrivals with almost no familiarity with California and no clear authority to act as a constitutional convention, produced a constitution that prohibited slavery. The prohibition was not primarily an expression of abolitionist sentiment, though some of the delegates did hold abolitionist views. It was primarily a practical calculation by men who understood that slave labour in the gold mines would undercut the wages of free miners, and that the free labour politics of the mining community was overwhelmingly opposed to the introduction of slavery into the diggings. The specific fears of the white 49ers, who had already demonstrated their hostility to the labour competition of foreign-born miners, extended to enslaved labour as well, and the constitutional prohibition of slavery in California was as much a product of this labour market anxiety as of any principled opposition to the institution. California's application as a free state threatened to upset the balance between slave and free states in the Senate that the Missouri Compromise had maintained since 1820. There were 15 slave states and 15 free states in 1849, giving each section equal representation in the Senate, and therefore equal ability to block legislation hostile to its interests. Adding California as a free state without simultaneously admitting a slave state would break this balance, giving the free states a permanent majority in the Senate and removing the slaveholding South's ability to protect its interests through the legislative process. The political crisis this generated, with Southern senators threatening secession if California were admitted, Northern representatives insisting on its admission without conditions, was the most acute crisis the Union had faced since the Missouri Compromise, and it was resolved temporarily through the Compromise of 1850, whose various provisions California admitted as a free state. The rest of the Mexican Cession organized without mention of slavery, a new and more stringent Fugitive Slave Act, the slave trade but not slavery abolished in the District of Columbia, papered over the fundamental conflict without resolving it. The Compromise of 1850 bought 10 years. The conflict that it postponed arrived with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the secession of South Carolina in December of that year. The California gold rush had not caused the Civil War. The causes of the Civil War were deeper and older than 1848, but it had accelerated the political crisis that the war resolved by forcing the question of slavery's expansion at a moment when the political system was not ready to resolve it, and producing a compromise that satisfied no one deeply and delayed resolution only by deferring it. The specific individuals whose stories illuminate the gold rush's character deserve more than passing mention, because the gold rush was not an abstraction, but a collection of specific human lives, and the lives at its center reveal something about what the event actually was that the aggregate statistics cannot. John Bidwell, who'd been among the first overland emigrants to California in 1841, and who by 1848 was working for John Sutter, was present at the discovery at Sutter's Mill and quickly established his own claim on a tributary of the Feather River. He made enough from mining to purchase Rancho Chico in the Sacramento Valley, which he farmed for the rest of his life, eventually becoming one of California's most prominent citizens, a congressman, a temperance advocate, and a presidential candidate for the Prohibition Party in 1892. His trajectory, from gold miner to established California landowner to national political figure, was the trajectory that the gold rush made possible, and that relatively few 49ers successfully achieved. But it illustrates the specific promise that the rush represented at its most optimistic. Lola Montez arrived in California in 1851, already famous across Europe and America as the mistress of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, a dancer and performer of considerable personal magnetism and theatrical skill, who understood that California in 1851 had an enormous appetite for entertainment and almost no supply of it. She settled in Grass Valley, gave performances of her famous spider dance, a theatrical piece in which she pretended to shake spiders from her skirt, the spiders being spring-loaded wires that produced an effect of alarming realism that the mining audiences received with the enthusiasm of men who'd been too long without female performers of any kind, and became one of the most celebrated figures of the gold rush cultural scene. She also mentored a young girl named Lotta Crabtree, the daughter of a Grass Valley miner, who she recognized had genuine performing talent and who she encouraged and trained until Lotta could perform for the mining camps herself. Lotta Crabtree became one of the most successful American performers of the 19th century, eventually earning millions from her theatrical career and leaving the majority of her estate to charity when she died in 1924. The thread from Lola Montez to Lotta Crabtree to the beneficiaries of Lotta's fortune is a small example of the specific human connections that the gold rush created in places and between people who would never otherwise have occupied the same room. Biddy Mason arrived in California in 1851 as an enslaved woman, brought by her enslaver Robert Smith from Georgia to Utah and then to California, where she was legally free under California's Free State Constitution, but where Smith had no intention of acknowledging that freedom. She filed for her freedom in the Los Angeles courts in 1856, a petition that required courage of a specific and remarkable kind from a woman who was legally property and who was challenging her enslaver in a legal system that was inconsistently applied to black Californians and one becoming a free person at 38. She worked as a midwife and nurse, saved her earnings with a discipline that reflected her understanding that economic security was the foundation of the freedom she had just legally acquired, bought land in what is now downtown Los Angeles in 1866, and spent the rest of her life acquiring property and providing charitable support to the poor of Los Angeles regardless of race. When she died in 1891, her estate was valued at $300,000, a remarkable accumulation by any standard of the period. Her story is a reminder that the gold rush brought to California not only the free migrants who chose to come, but the enslaved people who were brought without choice, and that what some of them made of California's peculiar promise of reinvention was as extraordinary as anything the 49ers accomplished. The gold rush ended, or rather it transformed. The gold rush ended, or rather it transformed, because there is no clear ending date for the California mining economy, only a gradual transition from one form of gold extraction to another, and then to the diversified economy that the mining period had made possible. The placer gold of the riverbeds was largely exhausted by the mid-1850s. The hydraulic mining operations that replaced it continued into the 1880s, until the Sawyer decision curtailed them. The hard rock mining of gold-bearing quartz veins, which required capital investment in tunnels and stamp mills and processing equipment that made it a corporate enterprise rather than an individual one, continued in some California districts well into the 20th century, and the 16-to-1 mine near Allegheny in Sierra County was still producing significant quantities of gold in the 1990s. But the gold rush, as a cultural moment, as the specific event that brought hundreds of thousands of people to California, built the cities and the institutions and the infrastructure, and created the California of the American imagination, was effectively over by 1855 or so. The men who had come expecting to make a fortune and return home in a year or two had made their decision. They had made the fortune and gone home, or they had not made the fortune and gone home, or they had decided that California was home regardless of what the gold had done, and they were staying. The California that emerged from the gold rush decade was not the California that had existed before it, and would not be. It was a new place, built in a decade by people from everywhere, carrying the specific marks of the specific circumstances of its creation in ways that would shape it permanently. The economic transformation that the mining period set in motion did not end with the mines. The agriculture that replaced mining as California's primary economic activity drew on the same irrigation infrastructure, the canals and flumes and reservoirs built to supply the hydraulic operations that the mining companies had built, redirecting them to the irrigation of the Central Valley and beginning the transformation of what had been a semi-arid grassland into the most productive agricultural region in North America. The railroad that connected California to the rest of the country in 1869, built primarily with Chinese labor, the same Chinese labor force that the gold rush had brought to California and that the mining camps had excluded, opened California's agricultural production to the national market and accelerated the development that the gold had initiated. The University of California, chartered in 1868, was funded in part by the proceeds of the mining economy and was from its founding oriented toward the practical challenges of California's agricultural and industrial development in ways that reflected the gold rush's legacy of applied problem-solving. The myth that the gold rush created, the California myth, the West Coast myth, the myth of the place where the old rules don't apply and a man can reinvent himself from scratch, has proven more durable than the mining economy that produced it. The specific dream of California as a place of unlimited reinvention and sudden transformation has drawn migrants from the rest of the United States and from the rest of the world continuously since 1848, through the agricultural migration of the Dust Bowl refugees in the 1930s, through the aerospace and entertainment industries of the mid-20th century, through the technology industry of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Silicon Valley's culture of the garage startup, the venture capital bet on an unproven idea, the willingness to risk everything on the possibility of extraordinary return. These are the gold rush's cultural inheritance, the specific California attitude toward risk and reward that the 49ers bequeathed to their successors. The startup founder who pitches his idea to a Sand Hill Road venture capitalist is performing, in the language of the 21st century technology industry, the same basic transaction as the 49er who bought his pan and his boots and his passage to California. A bet that the opportunity is real, that the effort will be rewarded, that the journey to California is worth everything it costs. The letters and diaries that the 49ers left behind are among the most vivid documents in the American archive. The men who wrote from the camps were writing to wives who'd been left with children and farms, to parents who had lent money for the passage, to siblings watching whether the gamble paid off. The letters reflect this awareness in the ways that anxious honesty expresses itself under social pressure, emphasis on genuine positives, the landscape, the adventure, the camaraderie, combined with the careful, often delayed acknowledgement of the genuine negatives. The miner who'd spent 3 months making barely enough to cover his expenses told his wife that things were slower than expected but improving. The miner who'd contracted dysentery told his parents he'd been somewhat unwell but was recovering. The miner who watched his partner die of cholera on the Nevada desert described the death briefly, and then moved on to a description of the mountains, because dwelling on the death would generate a worry that was 2,000 miles away and could do nothing constructive. The diaries were more honest, because the diarist was not writing for an audience of worried relatives, but for himself, for the record, for the future self who might someday want to remember what it had actually been like. The Gold Rush diaries that historians have collected are one of the great documentary resources of American social history, capturing the texture of daily life in the camps with an immediacy that no subsequent account can equal. The constant recording of prices, what things cost and what one was earning, the running calculation of whether the enterprise was paying off, appears in almost every mining diary, reflecting the fundamental economic nature of the undertaking and the anxiety about return that sustained or undermined the miners' morale through the months of the experience. The letters that wives and mothers wrote back have survived in smaller numbers, but capture something the miners' letters could not: the experience of the gold rush from the other side, the management of farms and businesses and children in the absence of husbands and fathers, the careful arithmetic of household economy conducted by women who had been left to manage everything alone while the men had adventures. The 49ers themselves, the men and women who actually went and actually dug and actually experienced the gold rush as a physical reality rather than a national myth, had decidedly mixed feelings about what it had been and what it had done to them. The surveys and reminiscences that researchers have collected from gold rush participants suggest that the majority of men who went to California did not make the fortunes they had expected. Most came home with something, more than they had left with, or the same amount or less, depending on when they had gone and where they had mined and how their luck had run. But the specific transformation from ordinary man to wealthy man that the promotional literature had promised was achieved by a much smaller proportion than the mythology implies. Those who did stay in California were more likely to prosper, not from mining, but from the businesses and professions and agricultural operations that the mining period had made possible, from the simple advantage of being present at the founding of a new place, where property and commercial position and professional reputation were available to those who established them early. The men who made the real fortunes of the gold rush were the merchants and the lawyers and the bankers and the landowners who built California's institutional framework in the decade after the gold was found, not the men who found the gold. The men who found the gold at the beginning, James Marshall, who noticed the glinting thing in the tail race on January 24th, 1848, and John Sutter, on whose property the discovery was made, did not profit from their association with the event. Marshall spent the rest of his life drifting through California, seeking employment and not always finding it, occasionally trading on his fame as the discoverer of California gold for whatever small payments curiosity about him could generate, dying in 1885 in a small cabin near Coloma, not far from the spot where he had made the discovery 37 years before. The California State Legislature, in one of those belated recognitions of historical significance that are as much about the legislature's need to acknowledge the past as about any genuine concern for the person being honoured, had voted him a small pension in the 1870s that was withdrawn and restored, and withdrawn again in the subsequent years, a treatment that managed to be both inadequate and inconsistent. John Sutter fared no better. The flood of miners onto his land destroyed his agricultural operations. His workers deserted him for the diggings, squatters occupied his property, and then litigated his title in the California Land Commission process that had been designed to protect landowners like him, but that proved in practice to be a mechanism for their dispossession. He died in a Washington hotel in 1880, having spent his last years petitioning Congress for compensation for the losses he attributed to the American government's failure to protect the property rights the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had promised. Congress never compensated him. His fort, which was the nucleus around which the Sacramento Valley settlement had organized, is a state historic park today, reconstructed to something approximating its 1840s appearance, visited by school children who learn about the gold rush, and about Marshall's discovery, and about John Sutter's empire, and about the event that changed California forever. The physical landscape of the gold rush is still present in California, if you know how to look for it. The hydraulic mining scars in the Nevada and Sierra Nevada foothills, the great white and orange gashes in the hillsides where monitors stripped away the soil and vegetation, are still visible from the air and from certain vantage points on the ground, more than a century and a half after the operations that created them were shut down. The rivers that carried the hydraulic tailings, the Yuba and the Bear and the American, still carry more sediment than they did before the gold rush, their channels still somewhat elevated above the pre-mining profile by the accumulation of material that a century and a half of post-mining water flow has not entirely redistributed. The old mining towns of the Mother Lode, Nevada City and Grass Valley and Placerville and Sutter Creek and the dozens of other communities strung along Highway 49, which is named for the 49ers, are present today as small California towns with 19th century commercial streets and Victorian houses and local museums full of the artifacts and the stories of the rush, many of them sustained by a tourism economy whose visitors are drawn by exactly the myth of the gold rush that the 49ers experience created. The gold itself, in the form that the California gold rush produced it, the coins and the bars and the commercial currency of the 1850s, has dispersed into the global gold supply in ways that make it impossible to track. But the specific gold of the California gold rush, the material fact of it, the specific chemical element extracted from the Sierra Nevada gravel in those years, helped fund the Union cause in the Civil War, providing the financial backing that allowed the Lincoln administration to sell the bonds that paid for the armies that preserved the United States. California gold financed the Transcontinental Railroad. California gold capitalized the banking houses that funded the agricultural development of the western United States. California gold, in the most literal sense, built the America that came after the gold rush, turning the promise of the Louisiana Purchase into the physical reality of a continental nation connected by steel rails and electric telegraph, and the accumulated capital of the world's largest peacetime gold rush. James Marshall picked up a small glinting piece of metal from the water on a January morning in 1848 and changed the world. The world he changed is the one we're living in. California with its 40 million people, the Pacific economy with its global reach, the technology industry with its gold rush ethos of the big bet and the sudden fortune, the American West with its complicated inheritance of indigenous dispossession, an immigrant aspiration, an environmental transformation, and the specific restlessness that comes from a place that has always been understood as the destination of the desperate and the ambitious and the dreaming. All of it flows, in ways both direct and indirect, from that January morning on the American River, from the glint in the water and the hand that reached down to pick it up. The night is settling in now, and the long story of the gold rush has reached its quiet end, not the end of California, which is still very much in progress, but the end of the specific chapter whose beginning was that January morning and whose end was the gradual dispersal of the rush's energy into the institutions and the myths and the physical landscape that it left behind. The mining camps are silent now, or they have become tourist destinations where the silence is curated rather than natural. The rivers run with their altered chemistry through their altered channels past the scarred hillsides and the new-growth forests. The cities that the gold rush built have been rebuilt so many times that almost nothing of the original structures remains, though the street grids and the neighborhood patterns and the commercial orientations of San Francisco and Sacramento still reflect the decisions that were made in the early 1850s by people working with great speed and almost no information about what they were building. The people who came to California in those years, the hundreds of thousands of them from every continent, speaking every language, bringing every ambition, left their marks in the California that exists today in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes not. The Chinese community of San Francisco's Chinatown is the direct descendant of the gold rush Chinese migration, sustained through a century and a half of alternating exclusion and inclusion into one of the most distinctive and most vital urban communities in the country. The Mexican-American communities of the California interior are the descendants of the ranchero families who were dispossessed by the gold rush and of the subsequent generations of Mexican migrants who came to work the agricultural California that replaced the mining California, maintaining a cultural presence in a state that was Mexican before it was American and that has never entirely forgotten it. The communities of memory that the California Indian tribes maintain, the cultural and linguistic preservation programs, the repatriation of ancestral remains from the museum collections that accumulated them in the 19th century, the assertion of tribal sovereignty and treaty rights that the gold rush's catastrophe had not extinguished, are the descendants of the people who were there before everyone else, and who survived what was done to them in the gold rush years through forms of resilience that the event's standard narrative has only recently begun to honour. Let that settle around you now. The American River is running tonight, cold and clear in the January darkness, through the foothill country where it all began. The hills above it still carry the marks of what was done to them, and they are also beautiful in the way that scarred landscapes can be beautiful, carrying their history and their contours. The gold that is still in these hills, and there is still gold in those hills, is not going anywhere. It has been there for millions of years, longer than the human beings who've contested it. and it will be there long after the last memory of the 49ers has faded from every living mind. But for now, in the long, slow turn of things, let the American River carry your attention downstream toward the valley, and let the night be quiet, and let the story that has been told settle into whatever shape it is going to take in your mind. The glint in the water on a January morning, the world that came rushing in response, the people it made and the people it broke and the place it created and the myths it planted that have been growing ever since. The specific geography of the California Gold Country, the Sierra Nevada foothills running roughly 200 miles from north to south between the Sacramento Valley and the high mountain crest, was itself a character in the gold rush story, and the men and women who inhabited it during the rush years responded to its specific character in ways that the landscape rewarded and punished in equal measure. The foothill country was beautiful in the specific California way, rolling oak woodland in the lower elevations, giving way to pine and fir forest as the altitude increased, the rivers running cold and clear from the Sierra snowpack through steep-sided canyons that the mining operations would transform in ways whose traces are still visible. The climate was hospitable by the standards of what many miners had come from. Mild winters compared to New England or the upper Midwest, dry summers that allowed outdoor work for months without interruption, though the specific combination of California's spring rains and summer heat produced a mud season that the early settlers found as disabling as any eastern winter, the trails turning to impassable bogs that could swallow a mule and its load, and then baking to a rock hardness in June that lasted until the November rains returned. Rest easy.